On a Tuesday morning in Lake Forest, Illinois, Antony Rourke was supposed to be down at the harbor. Instead, the 38-year-old head of the Rourke family stood behind the floor-to-ceiling glass of his study, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, watching 3 people gather in the rose garden less than 15 feet away. His mother, his younger brother, his brother's wife. They stood with their backs to the house, because they were certain he'd left at 6 that morning. Antony was a man who never raised his voice and never repeated himself. He'd spent 20 years inside this life, and 12 of them running it, and in all that time he hadn't once been found in a room where nobody expected him. So he didn't open the door. He didn't set the cup down. He just stood there and listened while the 3 people closest to him talked, in calm and reasonable voices, about what they intended to do to him and about the woman he'd married 6 weeks earlier. Her name was Meredith. She was upstairs, and she didn't know a thing. By the time they walked back inside, the coffee in Antony's hand had gone cold, and he still hadn't moved, because he had a decision to make now, and he knew he wouldn't get to make it twice. If stories about loyalty, betrayal, and the quiet strength of people the world underestimates are the kind you appreciate, take a moment to hit that like button. Share this with someone who'd understand it. And if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss what we tell next. Now let's go back to where all of this began 6 weeks earlier, on their wedding day. 6 weeks earlier, on a Saturday afternoon, Meredith Marsh pushed her mother's wheelchair across the threshold of the Rourke estate, and the 2 front wheels stopped at the edge of the thick carpet. She had to bend down, use both hands to lift the front of the chair, then push it forward. Not one of the 14 servants standing along the hallway stepped out to help her. They remained perfectly still, hands folded in front of them, eyes fixed straight ahead, as though what was happening were taking place several miles away. Ruth Marsh sat in the wheelchair, 58 years old, with end-stage kidney disease and 3 dialysis sessions every week, and she had told her daughter that morning that she wouldn't ask anyone for anything today. Meredith pushed her mother into the grand living room and positioned the chair where Ruth could see the entire room, then straightened and looked around. There were 43 guests from her husband's family. From hers, there was 1, and that one was sitting in a wheelchair. She had no brothers or sisters. Her father had died when she was 19. Her friends were teachers, and she hadn't sent an invitation to a single one of them because she didn't know what she was supposed to write on a card asking someone to come to a place like this. Antony Rourke walked over and held out his hand, and Ruth shook his before she shook anyone else's. He didn't offer any formal greeting. He only asked whether she needed to move her chair out of the sunlight, and when she said no, he nodded and walked away. That was everything he said during the first 20 minutes. Vivian Rourke, 63 years old, entered at 4 o'clock, and the entire room seemed to shift subtly toward her in a way that was difficult to put into words. She touched each person lightly at the elbow, called everyone by the correct name, and asked after exactly the right child who was away at college. When she reached Meredith, she took the young woman's hand between both of hers. She said Meredith had a very pleasant face. She said she was so glad her son had finally settled down. She said all of it in a voice so warm that it took Meredith several seconds to realize Vivian hadn't once called her by name. When it was time for the toast, Vivian rose, and no one needed to tap a glass because the room had already gone quiet. She said Antony had been named after her grandfather, a shipbuilder who had come from Krakow to Chicago at 17 years old, with $22 in his pocket, and that the name had always carried a responsibility with it. She said her son was the most responsible man she had ever known. Then she turned toward Meredith, still smiling, and said that ever since Antony was a little boy, he had always had a fondness for rescuing broken things, a bird with an injured wing, a dog abandoned on the street, and she believed that was his most beautiful quality. She raised her glass toward the bride. She wished the 2 of them happiness. A few polite laughs rose and faded almost immediately. Someone cleared a throat. Ruth Marsh gripped the arms of her wheelchair so tightly that her knuckles turned white, and Meredith saw it. So she did the only thing she could think of that might make her mother loosen her hands. She smiled. She lifted her glass until it was level with Vivian's eyes and held it there. She didn't say a single word. Of the 43 guests in that room, not one of them knew that she had spent 6 years standing in a classroom on the South Side, where every morning her students had to pass through a metal detector before entering, and that she had learned long ago that there were certain insults for which the worst possible answer was an answer at all. Antony set his glass down on the table. He crossed the room without hurrying, without looking at his mother. He stopped behind his wife and placed one hand on her shoulder, then left it there. He didn't say anything. He simply stood that way and looked around the room once, from left to right, slowly, until his gaze had completed a full circle. The laughter died completely. People began turning back to their plates. Someone started talking louder than necessary about the game from the night before. Vivian sat down, still wearing exactly the same smile she had worn when she stood up. From that moment, until the last guest left, no one mentioned the toast again. Later that night, when the two of them were finally alone in their room, Meredith asked him why he hadn't said anything. Anthony removed his cufflinks, set them neatly together, and told her that in this house, the thing that carried the most weight wasn't what he said, but what he chose not to have to say. She asked whether his mother ever changed her mind about someone. He was silent longer than Meredith expected. Then he said he didn't know, because in the past 20 years he had never seen her change her mind about anything. On the second morning after the wedding, Meredith went downstairs to the kitchen and told the housekeeper that she wanted breakfast at 7 o'clock because she had a class to teach. The housekeeper nodded, said, "Yes, ma'am," then walked straight into the small dining room and asked Vivian Rourke what time breakfast should be served. Vivian said 8 o'clock, as always. Breakfast was served at 8. Meredith never asked again, because by the end of her first week she had understood something very simple about this house. Every order passed through a single door, and that door wasn't the one to her room. On the fourth day, she needed $40 to buy paper and pens for her tutoring class. She opened her wallet and remembered that her old bank account had been closed before the wedding, on the advice of Arthur Kessler, the family attorney, who had explained with impeccable politeness that everything would be reorganized so it could be kept more orderly. She went to see Vivian. Vivian was sitting at her desk answering handwritten letters with a fountain pen. Without looking up, she asked Meredith how much she needed and what it was for. Meredith answered. Vivian wrote a figure in a small leather-bound ledger, summoned the housekeeper, handed the cash to him instead of to Meredith, and instructed him to record the expense. Then she said that if Meredith needed anything more next time, she should mention it a day in advance, because she didn't like unexpected expenses. Meredith took the $40 from the housekeeper's hand, thanked him, and walked out. She still kept her 2 tutoring sessions each week at the community center on 63rd Street on the south side, 2 hours each session, unpaid, with 7 11th grade students preparing to retake their literature exam. She had been teaching there since she was 24, and she saw no reason to stop simply because she had moved into a different house. On Tuesday night, when she came home just before 9 o'clock, Vivian was sitting in the living room with 2 friends. She looked up and introduced Meredith in her usual warm voice, saying this was Anthony's wife, and that Meredith was still keeping up her little charity project on the south side, and how admirable it was that a young woman still had time for things like that. The 2 women smiled. Meredith greeted them, wished them good night, and went upstairs. Anthony came home after midnight. He didn't ask about her evening, and she didn't tell him. During the second week, on a Thursday afternoon, Vivian called her into her private study and told her to close the door. She didn't invite Meredith to sit down. She opened a drawer, took out a checkbook, wrote the date, signed her name along the bottom line, then tore out the check and placed it on the desk facing Meredith, leaving the amount blank. She said she wasn't going to ask Meredith what she had married her son for, because that was a crude question, and she wasn't a crude woman. She said she only wanted to tell Meredith something that no one else in this house had been decent enough to say aloud. She said Meredith's mother needed dialysis 3 times a week, that the cost of keeping that treatment going for the next 10 years was an amount a public school teacher would never see in an entire lifetime, and that she was offering Meredith the chance to solve that problem in a single afternoon. She pushed the check another inch toward her. She told Meredith to write whatever number she believed was fair, that she wouldn't argue over it, and that the only thing she asked in return was for Meredith to leave this house before the end of the month, quietly, without drama, without forcing Anthony to choose between his wife and his mother, because when a man like her son was made to choose, both sides lost. Vivian sat perfectly straight, her hands resting on the desk, and waited. Meredith stepped forward. She picked up the check between 2 fingers, held it suspended for several seconds, then tore it in half, placed both pieces back on the desk exactly where the check had been, and turned them until they were neatly aligned. She didn't say anything. She turned and walked toward the door. Just as her hand touched the doorknob, Vivian spoke, not loudly, using exactly the same voice she had used at the wedding when asking guests about their children away at college. She told Meredith that she would regret not taking it. Meredith opened the door and stepped into the hallway. She passed 3 members of the household staff who were polishing picture frames on the wall, and not one of them looked up. She went upstairs to her room, took out her phone, and called the nursing facility to confirm her mother's dialysis schedule for the following week. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and wrote the schedule into the notebook she still used for grading papers. The day, the time, the doctor's name, the room number, all of it in straight, careful lines, exactly the way she recorded grades for her students. That night, Anthony came home at 11 o'clock and found his wife still sitting on the edge of the bed with her notebook open across her lap. He took off his jacket, hung it up, then sat in the chair across from her, and she asked him what he did for a living. She said she had asked him that question 3 times before the wedding, and all 3 times he had answered that he worked in construction and at the port, and all 3 times she had believed him because she had wanted to believe him. She said that this week she had stood inside a house where no one dared serve breakfast without first asking his mother, and where a 63-year-old woman could write a blank check as though it were an ordinary part of the day. She said she didn't need to be protected. She needed to know where she was living. Anthony didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, rested both elbows on his knees, and stared at the floor for a long while. Then he looked up and told her that he was the head of the Rourke family, that his father had died when Anthony was 26, and he had been in charge for 12 years since then, that the construction company was real and the port business was real too. But beneath both of them were many other things that weren't real in the same way at all. He gave her no names, mentioned no numbers, explained none of the machinery behind it. He simply told her what he was. Then he added that he had never lied to her, and that he never would. And he said it so calmly that it sounded almost like he was announcing a train schedule. Meredith asked why he had married her. He said because she was the only person he had ever met who didn't change the way she spoke when he walked into a room. She asked what he intended to do next. Antony said he had signed the papers with Arthur Kessler in February, that over the next 18 months he would shut down everything that wasn't legal, one piece at a time, in the order he had already worked out, and when it was finished, the only things left would be the construction company and the port business, both clean, both paying taxes, both able to open their books for anyone who wanted to look. She asked whether anyone else knew yet. He said his mother knew. His younger brother knew. In 10 weeks, he would present it formally to the council of the 5 families. She asked how they would react. Anthony stood, turned off the desk lamp, and said that wasn't something he needed to consider, because he had already made his decision. On Saturday night, Cormac and Sabrina came for dinner. Sabrina entered first and embraced Meredith as though they had known each other for years, saying she had meant to call all week but had been afraid of bothering her, then asking about Ruth with questions so specific that Meredith needed a moment to remember that she had never once told Sabrina the details of her mother's illness. Sabrina pulled out Meredith's chair for her. Sabrina poured water for Meredith before pouring any for herself. Throughout the entire meal, she was the only person at the table who called Meredith by name. Cormac was the opposite. He talked constantly, laughed loudly, told stories about a warehouse project in Cicero, and it wasn't until halfway through dinner that he finally set down the question he had been carrying with him since the moment he walked through the door. He asked his brother whether the Eastern Port contract had been signed yet. Antony said it had. Cormac asked whose name was on it. Antony said the company's. Cormac laughed and said he was only asking because a few men under him were getting nervous, that they had heard some vague rumors, that people were talking about the family changing the way it did business, and that he didn't believe those rumors himself, but he thought his brother ought to know they were out there. He said all of it with a smile. Antony set down his knife. He said the rumors were true. Then he picked up his knife and continued eating. The entire table fell silent. Vivian lowered her eyes to her plate. Sabrina reached for the water pitcher and poured more into Cormac's glass, even though it was still full. Cormac didn't ask another question for the rest of dinner. He moved on to talking about the new season, about a car he was thinking of buying, and he spoke a little louder than he had before. When the two of them left, Sabrina took Meredith's hand at the door and told her that if anything happened, anything at all, at any time, she should call and shouldn't hesitate. Meredith thanked her. She stood on the front steps, watching their car disappear through the gate, and she realized that through that entire evening, the only person who had been kind to her was also the only person she couldn't read at all. By the 4th week, Meredith had started walking from the community center to the bus stop on 63rd Street because she didn't want to ask for one of the Rourke cars, and she didn't want to add another line to Vivian's leather-bound ledger. The walk was about 3 blocks. She had made it for 6 years without ever giving it a thought. On Tuesday evening of the 5th week, she left the center at 6:45. It was already dark, and halfway through the 2nd block, she realized that a car behind her was moving at the pace of someone walking. She stopped beside an electrical cabinet to retie her shoelace, and the car stopped too. She stood and started walking again, and it rolled forward behind her. She didn't turn around. She remembered that there was a laundromat at the end of the block that stayed open until 9 o'clock, and she began walking faster toward its light, one hand already wrapped around the phone in her coat pocket, her thumb resting on the call button, counting every step to keep her breathing from slipping out of rhythm. Then she heard a second engine. A dark-colored car came up from the opposite lane, cut diagonally across the front of the vehicle following her, and stopped dead in the middle of the street, blocking it. There was no screech of brakes, no horn. The car behind her backed up about 6.5 feet, remained still for roughly 3 seconds, then turned right into a cross alley and disappeared. The door of the dark car opened. The person who stepped out was a very young man, and he said only 2 words, "Get in." Meredith looked at him beneath the streetlight, and in that silence she realized she was staring into a face whose papers she had graded for an entire semester. He was Theo Barrett. 6 years earlier, he had sat in the last row of her 11th grade classroom, and she had been the only teacher in the school who stayed after 4 o'clock to sit with him. Meredith opened the door and got into the back seat. The car pulled away. She asked what he was doing there. Theo said he drove for the Rourke family. She asked who he drove for. He said he drove for whoever needed him, and she understood immediately what that answer meant, because she had heard other people in the mansion call him the errand boy, right in front of him, in the same tone people used when referring to an object. She asked whether he had recognized her. Theo kept his eyes straight ahead through the windshield, and said he had recognized her on the day of the wedding, from the moment she pushed the wheelchair across the threshold. She asked why he hadn't said anything. He was silent for quite a while before answering that, in that house, the less you knew, the longer you lived. Neither of them said anything else for the rest of the drive. When the car stopped in front of the estate gates, Theo got out and opened the door for her, and before she stepped out, he said only one thing. She shouldn't walk anymore. Then he closed the car door and went around toward the rear of the garage without waiting for her to thank him. That night, Meredith told Antony everything, leaving out not a single detail, including the fact that the other car had stopped when she stopped. Antony listened to the entire account without interrupting her, and without asking her to repeat anything. He asked only 2 questions: what color the car had been, and which alley it had turned into. The next morning, he sent for Walter Nash. Walter Nash was 58 years old, and had served the family for 30 years. He was the man who had carried Antony on his shoulders at his father's funeral, when Antony was still too young to understand what was happening, and he entered the study with the bearing of someone who had never once needed to knock. Antony asked him about the car. Walter said he had sent men to check it out during the night, that the neighborhood had a high rate of theft, that every month there were dozens of cases involving someone being followed and then robbed in exactly that manner, and that in his 30 years of experience, this was almost certainly random. Antony asked about the community center cameras. Walter said he had obtained the hard drive, but the footage from Tuesday night was corrupted and couldn't be opened, something that happened all the time with old equipment the city had installed more than 10 years ago. He said all of it calmly, neither quickly nor slowly, and he didn't avoid Antony's eyes for even a second. Antony nodded. He thanked Walter. He told him to leave it alone, and that nothing more needed to be done. Walter asked whether he should increase the number of men around the estate. Antony said no, and that Walter should treat the matter as though it had never been mentioned. Walter nodded and left, closing the door behind him. Antony remained sitting in the study for a long time after the door had shut. He didn't call anyone else. He didn't write anything down. He simply remembered that 3 weeks earlier, during dinner, his younger brother had asked him about the Eastern Port contract. And he remembered that aside from Walter Nash, only 4 people in that house knew where Meredith taught, and which evenings she taught there. He began counting those 4 names in his mind, slowly, exactly the way he handled every number he had no intention of forgetting. Then he stood, went downstairs, and ate breakfast with his mother just as he did every other morning. On Tuesday morning of the 6th week, Cormac was the first to speak. He said the council of the 5 families would meet in 10 weeks, that his brother had registered an item on the agenda, and that he had paid 2 people just to find out what that item was called. He said the name of it was the full conversion plan. He asked his mother whether she understood what those 3 words meant. Then he answered the question himself, saying, they meant shutting down. They meant ending everything. They meant that over the next 18 months, not a single dollar would move through any channel except the construction company and the port. He said there were 200 people living off those channels, that many of them had been with their father since before Cormac was born, and that by September they would be thanked and then told to fend for themselves. He said his brother called that saving the entire family. He said he called it one man making a decision for 200 people, without asking a single one of them. Sabrina said he was calculating the wrong thing. She said the problem wasn't those 200 people, because those 200 people wouldn't have a vote on the council. She said the problem was that once the plan went through, Cormac would be left with exactly one title, construction site supervisor, and one salary that appeared on a tax return. She asked whether he had ever tried working out in his head exactly how much that would be. Cormac said he had already spoken to his brother, that he had asked him directly at dinner, and that the answer he got was exactly 7 words long. Sabrina said she knew. She had been sitting right beside him that night. Then she said there was something both of them were avoiding, saying aloud, so she would say it. She said no one in this house could force Anthony Rourke to change his mind. No one ever had, and no one ever would. She said the only option left was to make sure he was no longer in a condition to make any decisions at all. Cormac put a hand on the arm of his chair and asked what she was talking about. Sabrina said she wasn't talking about touching him. She said if anyone touched him, all 5 families would rise up, and none of the 3 people standing there would live to see the end of the month. She said there was another way, one that was much cleaner. She said the 63rd Street neighborhood had dozens of armed robberies every month, that everyone knew it, that the police in that district didn't even bother filing complete reports. She said when a woman walked alone to a bus stop at 7 o'clock at night in a neighborhood like that, anything could happen, and not one person in the world would ask a second question. She said they didn't have to kill him. Kill her first, she said, and a man like him would destroy himself. She went on, saying she had watched Antony for the past 6 weeks, that he had stood behind his wife at the wedding, that he had canceled 2 meetings that very week just so he could be home before 9 o'clock, and that when a man who had never had anything to lose suddenly did, that became the thinnest part of him. She said once he collapsed, the council wouldn't need anyone to overthrow him. The council would simply take the chair back, and the person who filled the vacancy would be the only Rourke left with the family name. Cormac was silent for a long time. Then he said she was talking about his brother's wife. Sabrina said she was talking about a school teacher whose face no one in this family had even known 2 months ago. A woman with no property, no relatives, and no one standing behind her. Cormac turned to his mother and asked what she thought. Vivian didn't answer immediately. She let the silence remain for several seconds, long enough that the other 2 had no choice but to wait. Then she said she had raised that boy for 38 years and had never once seen him soften. Not on the day his father died. Not on the day he took that chair at 26 years old. She said he had never softened until that girl walked into this house. Cormac asked what that was supposed to mean. Vivian said it meant, keep it clean, keep it fast, and don't make her hear another word about it. Then she stood, smoothed the sleeves of her clothes, and said it was time for breakfast. 15 minutes later, the 4 of them sat at the table. Anthony pulled out his chair and sat down. He picked up the coffee pot, poured for his mother first, then set it back down. Vivian thanked him. Cormac asked whether he was going to the port that day. Anthony said yes. Sabrina said the weather was beautiful. No one answered her. Breakfast lasted 20 minutes, and during those 20 minutes, Anthony didn't say another word. He finished everything on his plate. He folded his napkin, placed it on the table, stood, and walked out the door. That afternoon, Anthony made 3 phone calls from the car. He told Cormac that the ship from Rotterdam would arrive at the eastern port at 4 o'clock Friday morning. He told Walter Nash that it would arrive at 11 o'clock Saturday night. He told Arthur Kessler that it would arrive at 6 o'clock Sunday evening. 3 calls, 3 different times, and only one of those 3 numbers was true. Then he made a 4th call. Theo Barrett was washing a car in the garage out back when his phone vibrated. Anthony didn't exchange any pleasantries. He told him that starting the next morning, Theo wouldn't drive for anyone else. He said Theo would take his wife wherever she needed to go, wait there, bring her home, and if she went somewhere on foot, he was to walk behind her at a distance of about 30 paces. He said Theo wasn't to let her remain out of his sight for more than 5 minutes, including the evenings she spent at the community center, including if she told him to go home. Theo asked whether Anthony wanted him to report anything back. Anthony said yes, everything, including things Theo thought were trivial, including a car parked where it shouldn't be. Theo asked one more question, what he was supposed to say if someone in the house asked why he was following the lady of the house around all day. Anthony said to tell them he had ordered it, and if they asked anything more, tell them to come ask him directly. The call ended there. On Thursday morning, Meredith arrived at the nursing facility in Evanston, and the person at the front desk told her that her mother had been transferred the day before. She asked where. The person handed her a slip of paper with the address of a facility nearly 40 minutes away by car, farther west, and said that Mrs. Marsh's contract had been canceled by the payer on Tuesday afternoon. Meredith asked who the payer was. The person looked at the screen, hesitated, then said she should ask the family attorney. Theo drove her there. The new facility was housed in a row of low buildings, with vinyl-covered hallways, and Ruth's room had 4 beds separated by curtains. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, folding a few sets of clothes back into a cloth bag herself, and the moment she saw her daughter come in, she said that this place was all right too, that the nurses were kind, that her dialysis schedule was still the same 3 sessions a week, only the shuttle took a longer route now, so she had to get up an hour earlier. Meredith sat beside her and asked whether she knew who had been paying for the old place. Ruth looked at her for a moment, then said she had meant to tell her a long time ago. She said that since March of the previous year, 8 months before the wedding, a payment had been transferred directly into her medical account every month, and when she called to ask about it, they told her only that the person making the payments had requested that their identity remain confidential. She said she had asked Antony about it exactly once, at the wedding, when he shook her hand. She said he hadn't admitted it and hadn't denied it. He had only asked whether she wanted her chair moved out of the sunlight. Meredith sat in silence for a very long time. Then she helped her mother finish folding the clothes in the cloth bag, hung them on the hook behind the door, and asked what time the shuttle would pick her up the next morning. On the drive home, she didn't say a word. At 7 o'clock that evening, she arrived at the estate and went straight into Vivian's study without knocking. Vivian was writing letters by hand as she always did. She set down her pen, looked up, and asked what was wrong. Meredith said her mother had been transferred. Vivian said yes, that was correct. On Tuesday afternoon, she had called Arthur Kessler and asked him to review every recurring expense charged under the family name, and that payment was one that appeared in no agreement of any kind, had been made continuously for 20 months, and was going to someone outside the family. She said she had stopped it, and that it was something that should have been done a long time ago. Meredith asked whether she knew Antony had been paying it before he ever proposed. Vivian said she knew. She said that was precisely why she stopped it. She said when a man paid for a woman before marrying her, that wasn't love. It was an investment. And she had lived long enough to know that every investment eventually came with someone asking for a return. She picked up her pen and said that if Meredith needed money to cover the difference, she only had to mention it a day in advance, like any other expense, and Vivian wouldn't ask another question. Meredith remained standing where she was. She said Vivian could take away everything she had given her. But Vivian had never given her anything at all. Vivian didn't become angry. She didn't even change her expression. She said Meredith was absolutely right, that this was exactly what she wanted her to understand, and that when someone entered a house carrying nothing, that person had nothing to hold on to either. Then she lowered her head and resumed writing, and she didn't look up again. Meredith turned and left. She went upstairs, opened the notebook she used for grading papers, turned to the first blank page, and wrote down 3 lines: the date her mother had been transferred, the name of the new facility, and the name of the person who had signed the order canceling the contract. Then she closed the notebook and put it in the bottom drawer. Sabrina called on Saturday morning and said she had heard about what happened to Mrs. Marsh and didn't think it was right, that she had meant to call since Thursday, but had been afraid that calling too soon would make her seem nosy. She invited Meredith to lunch at a small restaurant near the lake, and she said she had chosen that place because it wasn't somewhere the Rourke family usually went. Theo drove Meredith there and remained in the car across the street. For the first half of lunch, Sabrina talked only about Ruth, asking whether the new facility was far away, whether her dialysis schedule had been disrupted, whether Meredith needed her to introduce someone she knew in the insurance business. She asked the kinds of questions no one in that house had ever asked, and she even remembered the name of a medication Meredith had mentioned only briefly, once during dinner the other night. Then she set down her fork and said there was something she had been struggling with, and she didn't know whether she should say it. Meredith told her to go ahead. Sabrina said that about 4 years ago, there had been a woman named Claire. She said Claire worked in the accounting department of the construction company, was 28 years old, and Antony had been seeing her for nearly a year. She said that at the time, even she had thought the 2 of them would get married. Then she said that sometime during a week in October, Claire left her job, and no one ever saw her again. Meredith set down her glass of water and asked what that meant. Sabrina said it meant nothing at all. No breakup. No one ever mentioned her name again. Her personnel file was closed, and Sabrina's mother-in-law said the girl had moved to another state. She said she had believed that for 4 years. Then she looked at Meredith and said she was only telling her because she genuinely cared about Meredith. That perhaps there was nothing to it at all. That people moved away without telling anyone all the time, and that she was sorry if she had made Meredith uncomfortable. She changed the subject immediately afterward, and asked whether Meredith planned to return to teaching full-time in the fall. She paid for lunch. She hugged Meredith at the restaurant door and told her to call any time. On the drive home, Meredith sat in the back seat and said nothing. She remembered that her husband had told her he had never lied to her and never would, and she realized that statement only had value if she knew exactly which questions to ask. She also remembered that for the past 2 weeks, every time she had asked him about the car from that night, he had said the matter was being handled and hadn't said anything more. On Sunday afternoon, Anthony drove out alone. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He arrived at the nursing facility to the west shortly before 4 o'clock, and he had to ask twice before he found the right room. Ruth Marsh was sitting beside the window with a newspaper folded into quarters across her lap. She recognized him immediately. He pulled over a chair and sat across from her. He didn't waste time circling around the subject. He told her he had come to say that the transfer was his fault, that he hadn't anticipated it, and that he would arrange to have it corrected that week. Ruth said she didn't need him to correct anything. She said this place was fine too. The nurses were kind, and she had been used to waking early her entire life. Then she asked him a question. She asked whether he knew which school her daughter taught at. Anthony said yes. She asked whether he knew how many teachers worked there. He said no. Ruth held out her hand, and he gave her his. She took his hand between both of hers and told him there were 40 teachers in that entire school, that her daughter was the only one who stayed after 4 o'clock. And did he know why? Because no one had ever told her she had to stay. She went on to say that was the year Ruth had first become ill, that there were only the 2 of them left in the family, that she had told her daughter to quit and find another job that paid more, and the girl hadn't listened. She said that in 29 years, her daughter had never once gone against her about anything except that one thing. Anthony sat in silence. Ruth tightened her grip on his hand slightly and said she wasn't asking what he did for a living, that she was old enough to know there were some questions a person shouldn't ask, and that there was only one thing she wanted to tell him. She said her daughter had never taken anything from anyone in her entire life. Then she released his hand and told him to go home before traffic got bad. Anthony stood. He reached the door, then stopped and asked whether she needed anything. Ruth said she needed him not to let her girl be alone in that house. He said yes. On the drive home, he didn't turn on the radio. He drove more slowly than usual, and by the time he reached the gates of the estate, night had fully fallen. He remained sitting in the car for several more minutes before opening the door and stepping out. By the 8th week, the answer had come. At 11 o'clock Saturday night, 3 men from the Sloan family were waiting at Pier 4 of the Eastern Port, and they remained there for nearly 2 hours before realizing there was no ship coming at all. 11 o'clock Saturday night was the time Anthony had given to only one person. On Sunday morning, his men sent back 3 photographs taken from inside a car. Anthony looked at all 3 of them very slowly, then deleted them. He remained sitting there for a long time afterward. 30 years. The man who had carried him on his shoulders at his father's funeral, the only person in the house who was allowed to enter his study without knocking. Anthony didn't summon Walter Nash to his study. He didn't let anyone touch him. On Monday, he met Walter in the garage, asked how his wife was doing with the knee surgery she needed, then told him that the following week, he needed Walter to go personally to Milwaukee for 3 days to handle a warehouse contract. There was no contract in Milwaukee. From that day forward, everything that passed through Walter Nash's hands was something Anthony wanted someone else to believe. He gave him ships that didn't exist, names that belonged to no one, money that had never been transferred. He told no one about it, not even his wife, and that was the second time he chose not to speak. On Thursday evening of that week, Meredith had class at the community center as usual. Theo drove her there at 5 o'clock, and he didn't leave. He parked about 65 feet from the main entrance, shut off the engine, and sat inside the car for 2 full hours. At 7 o'clock, she dismissed her 7 students, stood at the door, and watched each of them board the bus, then went back inside. She stayed behind to straighten the desks and chairs, put the stack of tests back into her bag, turn off the lights in the rooms farther down the hall, and stepped into the corridor at 7:20. Theo was already standing by the door. He didn't explain why he had come inside. He only said he was walking her to the car. The community center hallway was long and brightly lit, running straight toward the front parking lot. They had gone about 2/3 of the way when Theo stopped. He didn't say anything. He simply put one arm out across Meredith's path. She looked ahead and saw 2 figures who had just entered through the main doors, their heads completely covered, walking side by side without hurrying. One of them reached inside his coat. The other didn't break stride. Theo turned, shoved Meredith toward the nearest classroom door on the left, and pushed her so hard that she fell inside. He stepped out into the middle of the hallway. She heard him say something very short, but she couldn't make out the words. Then came the explosions. 2 shots, less than a second apart, crashing against all four walls of the corridor and making the entire row of glass doors tremble. Meredith lay on her side on the classroom floor, her ears ringing, unable to understand what had just happened. She heard running footsteps, the main door slamming against the wall, then an engine roaring to life in the parking lot and fading into the distance. After that came silence. She stayed where she was and counted to 10, then crawled to the doorway, gripped the edge of the wall to pull herself upright, and looked into the hall. The lights were still on. Theo's coat lay on the floor about 5 steps away, one sleeve folded beneath it, and he was lying beside it, motionless. She called his name. He didn't answer. She dropped to her knees, pulled her phone from her pocket, and entered the wrong passcode twice before she managed to make the call. She gave the community center's address, the street name, the building number, all of it clearly, her voice steady, using exactly the same voice she used when dictating words to her students. Then she took off her coat, folded it, and slid it beneath the back of his neck. She took his hand. She told him the ambulance was coming. She asked whether he could hear her, told him not to close his eyes, asked whether he remembered all those afternoons in 11th grade when he had stayed behind with her, told him she still had his final exam, told him he had gotten 7.5 points, and hadn't believed it. She kept talking like that without stopping for even a second, until red emergency lights swept across the walls of the hallway, and the sound of stretcher wheels came rattling in from outside. The ambulance took him away at 10 minutes to 8. Meredith sat in the front passenger seat, still carrying the stack of tests in her bag. Anthony arrived at the hospital at 10 past 9. He didn't ask anyone a single question in the hallway. He walked straight into the waiting room, saw his wife sitting there with both hands resting on her knees, and sat down beside her. They remained that way for nearly 3 hours without either of them saying a word. The doctor came out after midnight and said the young man was out of danger, that one bullet had struck the soft tissue along his side and another had grazed his shoulder, that he had lost a considerable amount of blood, but he was going to live. Meredith nodded. She thanked him. Then she turned to her husband and asked him one question. She asked why Theo had been in that hallway. Anthony didn't answer her there in the waiting room. He led his wife out into the 3rd-floor hallway, where 2 plastic chairs sat against the wall beside an empty vending machine, and he sat down. 3 o'clock in the morning. He said Theo had been there because Anthony had ordered him to be there. He said he had ordered Theo to follow her for the past 2 weeks. Meredith asked since when. Anthony said since Tuesday morning of the 6th week. She asked what had happened that morning. Then he told her. He told her that he hadn't gone to the port that morning, that he had stayed in the house, and that the other 3 had gone off to talk, because they believed he had already left. He repeated every word, without shortening anything, without softening any part of it. He said his younger brother had talked about the 200 people who would lose their livelihoods, and about how he would be left with nothing more than a construction site supervisor's title. He said Sabrina had talked about how there were dozens of armed robberies every month around 63rd Street, and how no one ever asked a second question. He repeated the exact words she had used, that they didn't need to kill him, kill her first, and a man like him would destroy himself. Then he stopped. Meredith sat perfectly still, both hands still resting on her knees, just as they had been in the waiting room. She asked what his mother had said. Anthony was silent for several seconds. He said his mother had said he had never softened until that girl walked into the house. He said that after that, she told them to keep it clean, keep it fast, and don't make her hear another word about it. He said that 15 minutes later, all 4 of them had sat down to breakfast, and he had poured her coffee. Meredith didn't say anything for a very long time. Then she asked why. For 8 weeks, he hadn't said a single word to her. Anthony said that if she had known, she would have changed the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she looked at those 3 people over dinner, and they would have known immediately that he had heard them. He said that at the time he needed them to believe he knew nothing. Meredith asked whether he had ever intended to tell her if nothing had happened tonight. Anthony said he didn't know. It was the truth, and it was harder to hear than a lie would have been. He didn't try to repair it. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out a thick envelope, and placed it on her lap. He said that inside was a replacement passport in her name, an open ticket, and enough cash for 3 years. He said 2 of his men had been waiting downstairs in the parking lot since 9 o'clock that night, that they would take her straight to the airport before morning, that her mother would be transferred to another facility about 40 minutes from wherever Meredith would be staying, and that every expense had already been paid through the end of the following year. He said he wouldn't look for her, and he wouldn't blame her for a single thing. He said that if she stood up and left right now, it would be the rightest thing she could do. Meredith picked up the envelope. She opened it, looked inside, read her name on the passport, then closed it again, and set it on the empty chair beside her. She said there was a boy lying on the floor below them, that 6 years ago that boy had sat in the last row of her classroom and no one in the school had even bothered to remember his name, that tonight he had stepped into the middle of that hallway in her place, and that if she got on a plane tonight, then what had he stepped into that hallway for? She said she wasn't going anywhere. Anthony looked at her. He didn't try to persuade her again. He only asked if she was sure. She said she was. Then she said she would stay. But she had one condition, and she needed him to listen carefully. She said he would do whatever he had to do, and she wouldn't ask, and she wouldn't interfere. But no one was going to die because of her. She said not his brother, not that woman, not his mother, not the 2 men from tonight, not anyone. She said she had spent 7 years standing in a school where every year there was one student who didn't come back in September, and that she couldn't live with another name being added to that list because of her. She told him to promise her. Anthony didn't answer. Meredith said it again. Promise me. He looked directly into her eyes, and still, he said nothing. She waited. She waited longer than she thought she was capable of waiting. In the 3rd-floor hallway, there was nothing but the intermittent hum of the vending machine and the sound of cartwheels rolling somewhere at the far end of the corridor. He had told her that he had never lied to her and never would, and that was exactly why he couldn't open his mouth now. Meredith understood. She stood, picked up the envelope, and placed it in his hand, then walked toward the elevator to go downstairs to Theo. She didn't turn around. Anthony remained alone on the plastic chair, the envelope in his hand, until morning came. Theo was on the 4th floor, in room 412, and by the 3rd day he was able to sit up. He didn't watch television. He borrowed Meredith's old laptop and told her he just wanted something to do so he wouldn't have to think so much. On Monday morning, when she walked into his room, he turned the screen toward her and told her to sit down. He said he had looked up Cormac Rourke's marriage records at the Cook County Courthouse, public records, available to anyone who knew where to look. He said he hadn't searched because he suspected anything, but because that night in the hallway, one of the 2 men had said something in an accent that people from around here didn't have, and for the 3 days he had been lying in that bed, he had kept hearing that sentence over and over in his head. He pointed at the screen. On the marriage license from 3 years earlier, the bride's name was listed as Sabrina Marie Doyle, and on the line identifying her parents, her mother's name was Eileen Doyle. Theo said he had searched Eileen Doyle next. He said she had married in 1994, divorced in 2001, and the divorce record listed the husband's name. He turned the screen a little farther toward Meredith. She read the name and sat perfectly still. The husband was Gregor Sloane. She read it again, more slowly, then asked whether he was certain. Theo said he had cross-checked it 3 times, that the year of birth matched, the former address matched, and the divorce record listed a daughter born in 1996. He said that when her parents divorced, the daughter had changed her surname to her mother's. Meredith asked whether Cormac knew. Theo was silent for a moment, then said that if Cormac knew, he wouldn't have had to pay 2 people just to find out what his brother's agenda item was called. He said people around the house still told stories about how Cormac liked to brag to the men beneath him that he had married some girl with no family and no one behind her, so he could do whatever he wanted. Theo said Cormac had believed that for 3 years. Meredith sat in front of that screen for a very long time. Then she asked him one question. What would happen if she gave this to her husband right now? Theo said Anthony would act immediately, and if he acted immediately, everyone in the house would know who had done the searching. He said he was already lying there with 2 holes in his body, and he didn't want to end up lying there again. Meredith closed the laptop. She said she needed a few days. Theo asked what she intended to do. She said she didn't know yet, but she knew one thing for certain. Evidence about Sabrina alone wasn't enough, because Sabrina wasn't the person signing off on the money. When Meredith returned to the estate, she began paying attention to something she had been seeing for 2 months without ever putting a name to it. Vivian didn't lower her voice when Meredith walked past. She spoke on the telephone in the living room, in the hallway, out on the veranda, and when Meredith came in to get a bottle of water or carry a stack of papers upstairs, Vivian didn't stop for even a second. She had been doing it from the very first day. People didn't lower their voices in front of a chair. Meredith began lingering longer in the rooms where Vivian was present. She brought her books down to the living room and graded papers there. She remained at the breakfast table until noon. She never wrote anything down in front of Vivian. She only listened, and she listened exactly the way she listened to her 7 students read aloud, which meant remembering precisely where a person hesitated. Then she went upstairs and wrote everything in the notebook she used for grading: the date, the time, the name, the number. By the 4th day, She heard Vivian tell someone that she had already transferred this month's payment and that the other party shouldn't call the house phone anymore. On Friday afternoon, Vivian went to have her hair done as she always did, 3 hours, once a week, on a schedule that never changed. Meredith went into her study. The leather-bound ledger was in the second drawer, exactly where Vivian always kept it before taking it out to record the $40 for paper and pens. Meredith turned through the first pages, which contained nothing but household expenses, groceries, flowers, servants' wages. Then, beginning around the middle of the ledger, the handwriting remained the same, but the entries contained only a date, a number, and 2 initials. The figures began in March, and every one of them was a 6-digit number. In the margin of the final page was an account number written by hand, and beneath that number was a scrawled signature that wasn't Vivian's. Meredith took out her phone and photographed 17 pages, 1 photograph for each page, holding her hands steady to keep them from shaking. When she finished, she sent everything to Theo without adding a single word, then returned the ledger to exactly where it had been in the drawer, closed it, and walked out. She went back to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and only then did she realize that both of her hands were trembling. On the drive home, Vivian called the housekeeper and instructed him to serve dinner half an hour earlier, and there was nothing unusual in her voice at all. That Sunday, Vivian invited the entire family home for dinner. Cormac and Sabrina arrived at 6 o'clock, Arthur Kessler arrived at 6:15, carrying a document case, and 2 older men were there as well, men Meredith had seen at the wedding but whose names she had never known. Dinner proceeded normally, until the main course had been cleared away. Then Vivian set down her napkin and said there was something she needed to say in front of everyone, because if she said it privately to her son, he wouldn't believe her. She turned to the housekeeper and told him to bring it down. He placed a prepaid phone on the table, a cheap one with a black plastic case. Vivian said she had sent someone to replace the curtains upstairs that afternoon, and they had found the phone behind the bottom drawer in Antony and his wife's room, the very drawer that only one person ever used. She pushed the phone toward the center of the table with a light touch, the way someone might slide a serving dish toward a guest. She said there were 11 outgoing calls on it over the past 6 weeks, all of them to the same number, and that number belonged to someone connected to the Sloan family. Then she turned to Arthur Kessler and told him to explain the rest. Kessler opened his case. He said that at Mrs. Rourke's request, he had reviewed the flow of money connected to Meredith Marsh's name, and he had discovered an account opened at a bank in Naperville under her name 20 months earlier. He said a total of $200,000 had passed through that account. He said the deposits came in regularly every month, on the same day, in roughly the same amounts, with a consistency too exact to be accidental. Vivian said she had spent the entire afternoon comparing the records. She said the first transfer into that account had occurred in March of the previous year, 8 months before the wedding, at a time when her son hadn't even proposed to Meredith yet. She asked everyone at the table whether anyone could explain why a stranger had been receiving money from this family before she ever set foot inside the house. Meredith remained still. She knew exactly what that money was. It was her mother's medical care, the expenses her husband had quietly paid for 20 months, and someone had routed the money through an account in Meredith's name before it reached the nursing facility. She also knew that if she said that aloud now, it would be nothing more than the word of someone who had nothing in her hands to prove it. So she said nothing. She only looked at Arthur Kessler and made herself remember that not once had he lifted his eyes from the papers in front of him. Cormac spoke first, saying he had warned them from the beginning that this wasn't a good idea. Sabrina placed her hand over Meredith's and said there had to be some misunderstanding, her voice sounding as though she were about to cry. The 2 older men looked at Antony. Antony set down his knife and fork. He looked at the phone on the table for several seconds, then said only one thing. His wife hadn't done it. Vivian asked what he was basing that on. Antony said he didn't need to base it on anything. No one said another word. But later that night, when the 2 of them returned to their room, he closed the door and told her she had to leave. Meredith asked whether he believed his mother. Antony said no. He said the money was money he had transferred, that he had routed it through an account in Meredith's name so his mother wouldn't find it during one of her reviews, and that Vivian had discovered it and turned it backward into this. He said the very reason Meredith had to leave was because he didn't believe his mother, because Vivian had spent an entire afternoon building this story for no other reason than to force him to choose, and if he kept Meredith in the house, next time it wouldn't be a cheap plastic phone. He said he couldn't keep her here. He said he needed her alive. The next morning, Meredith packed her things into the same suitcase she had brought with her on her wedding day. At the door, the housekeeper was waiting, and told her that under the lady of the house's orders, every personal device had to be inspected before it left the property. He took her phone, handed it to a man standing beside him, and that man carried it into another room for about 20 minutes. When they returned it, the phone had been restored to factory settings. There were no photographs left. There were no messages left. Meredith took the phone, thanked him, and walked out. Her old apartment on the south side had one room, a single burner electric stove, and a window that looked directly onto the brick wall of the building next door. She set her suitcase on the floor, plugged her phone in to charge, then sat down at the table. She didn't open the suitcase. She took out the notebook she used for grading and a stack of blank paper. She drew 4 columns. The first was labeled date. The second was labeled name. The third was labeled event. The fourth was labeled who can prove it. She started with the wedding day and worked forward, leaving out no date, including the days when nothing had happened at all. By nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, she had filled 7 pages. She read through everything once from the beginning, underlined 3 lines, then poured herself a glass of water, sat back down, and continued writing. On Monday morning of the 10th week, Theo was discharged from the hospital. He took a bus down to the south side, walked slowly from the stop to Meredith's apartment, and when she opened the door, he simply held out a memory card. He said all 17 photographs were still intact, that he had made 3 copies and stored them in 3 different places the very day he received them. He added that he had also saved the entire Cook County court record on Sabrina. Meredith invited him inside, poured him a glass of water, and the two of them sat at the table for 4 hours. She showed him the 7 pages she had written. Theo read them from beginning to end, then asked what she intended to do with them. Meredith said she had spent 3 nights thinking about it, that if she gave them to her husband, he would handle everything in his own way, and that she had promised herself she wouldn't let that happen. She said there was somewhere else she could take them. Theo asked whether she understood what handing them to the federal authorities meant. He said there were names in those pages belonging to people she loved and people she didn't, and that once she handed them over, she couldn't take them back. Meredith said she understood. She said she had been teaching long enough to know that when a child was being beaten at home, the hardest part wasn't knowing. The hardest part was forcing yourself to write that person's name down on paper. On Wednesday morning, she went to the FBI office building on Roosevelt Road, stood in line to pass through security like every other citizen, and waited 40 minutes in the reception area. The person who came out to meet her was a female agent in her 40s. Meredith placed the 7 pages on the table, along with the memory card and printed copies of the 17 ledger pages, including the handwritten account number on the final page. She clearly stated her name, her address, and her relationship to the Rourke family, and she said she wasn't asking for immunity and wasn't asking for protection. The agent asked her twice whether she understood what that meant, and both times Meredith said yes. The interview lasted 3.5 hours. When she left, she was given a case number written on a small piece of paper, and she folded it and tucked it into the notebook she used for grading. That same morning, on the north side of the city, Anthony Rourke walked into the headquarters of the Council of the 5 Families, 6 weeks ahead of schedule. No one had been warned. He placed a bound file on the table and said he wasn't asking for a vote. He was only informing them. He said that effective that day, the Rourke family was withdrawing from every joint operation, that the 3 western routes would close within 30 days, that the port business would move completely into legal operations, and that he wouldn't accept another share of money from any source after the first day of the following month. One man asked whether he understood what that would mean for the people whose livelihoods depended on those routes. Antony said yes, and said the construction company would take in as many of them as wanted the work, on the books, with insurance, starting Monday. Another man asked whether he had discussed this with his family. Antony said this wasn't something to be discussed. The meeting ended after 40 minutes. No one shook his hand when he left. What no one in that room said aloud, though every one of them understood, was that if the Rourke family dismantled itself with its own hands, then the chair at the head of that family would no longer be worth anything, and the man waiting to sit in it would inherit nothing but an empty name. Antony walked out of the building at 11:40. Theo was driving that day. He had been back at work for only 2 days, and still had to turn his body slowly when fastening his seatbelt, and Antony had told him to sit in the passenger seat and let someone else drive. Theo said he was fine. Antony looked at him for a moment and didn't argue. The car headed south along Wells Street. The sky was overcast, and traffic was normal. Antony sat in the back seat without speaking for the entire drive, and shortly before noon he told the driver to stop by the community center on 63rd Street before heading home. Those were the last words Theo ever heard him say. At the 3rd intersection, the light turned yellow, then red. The car stopped in the far right lane. Theo was looking down at his phone to check an address when he heard a motorcycle engine revving from behind them on the left, closer than it should have been, and he looked up. He had only enough time to see two people on the motorcycle, the passenger already lowering one hand to the level of the car window. Theo shouted Antony's name. Then came two shots, very close, almost on top of each other, exploding inside the car so violently that Theo's hearing vanished for several seconds. Glass shattered. Car horns in the surrounding lanes began blaring wildly. Someone opened a door and ran, and the motorcycle slipped between two lanes and disappeared ahead. Theo yanked at the seatbelt release, twisted around, and called Antony's name again. There was no answer. He called a third time, louder, one hand already gripping the back of the front seat as he tried to pull himself across. Nothing. There was only the long, unbroken wail of car horns, someone outside shouting for an ambulance, and the traffic light at the intersection quietly changing from red to green. 7 days later, his condition had stabilized in the way doctors use the word stable. One bullet had passed through his shoulder. The other had caused a traumatic brain injury. And after a surgery that lasted 9 hours, they kept him under deep sedation for 4 days, before gradually reducing the medication. By the 7th day, the drugs were completely out of his system, but he still hadn't opened his eyes. The doctor said every indicator was improving, and that whether he would wake up, or when he might wake up, was something no one could answer. During those 7 days, Cormac Rourke took control of everything under the title of acting head. He reversed everything his brother had announced before the council, called each of the 5 families personally, and told them that those decisions had been made by a man under tremendous pressure, and that now everything would return to the way it had been. Vivian hired a private nurse named Marla Pratt to remain in the hospital room throughout the day, paid her twice the normal rate, and paid her in cash. She also had the hospital informed that the family wanted visitation restricted, and the only name placed on the list of people who weren't allowed inside was Meredith Marsh. None of them thought to check the legal records, because in their eyes, she was a woman who had nothing at all. Meredith went to the hospital every morning for those 7 days, and every morning she was stopped at the first floor desk. She didn't argue once. She only asked for the name of the person on duty that day, then wrote it down. 3 days after the wedding, Antony had signed 2 documents at Arthur Kessler's office and had them kept on file there. One was a medical power of attorney, naming his wife as the person authorized to make treatment decisions if he became unable to do so himself. The other was a full power of attorney, covering legal and business matters, properly notarized, with no automatic revocation clause. Both documents remained inside Kessler's filing cabinet for 7 days, and not one person opened them to read what they said. Inside that hospital room, Antony regained consciousness on the 5th day. He knew he was awake because he could hear. He heard the steady counting of the monitor, the wheels of carts moving through the hallway, the sound of water running into the sink in the corner of the room. He couldn't see anything. His eyelids wouldn't lift. He tried moving his fingers, then his toes, and nothing responded. He lay there that way and listened. Within those 4 walls, his hearing was the only thing that still belonged to him, and it became so precise that he could distinguish one person's footsteps from another's before the door even opened. Cormac came in the afternoons, usually alone. He pulled a chair close to the bed and spoke to his brother the way someone might speak to a table. He told him he had already called all 5 families, that none of them had objected, that apparently Antony had been the only person who ever wanted that plan in the first place. He laughed and said that if Antony had listened from the beginning, he wouldn't have ended up like this. He told him that the girl had already been thrown out of the house, that their mother had done a remarkable job fabricating the whole thing, that he hadn't known she could make it look so clean. One afternoon he said he didn't actually want Antony to die, sincerely, because a brother who lay there motionless was far more convenient than a brother who was dead, since dead men had funerals, and funerals brought people who asked questions. He said it, then sat there laughing to himself for quite a long time. Marla Pratt was always perfectly punctual. In front of Vivian, she spoke softly and called him Mr. Rourke. When only the 2 of them were left in the room, she would wash his body while muttering that men like him caused all kinds of trouble and then ended up lying there making other people wait on them, that the money wasn't worth it, that she had cared for 6 patients like him, and not one of them had ever woken up, that if a person was going to lie like this, it would be easier just to die. She said those things in an even voice, without any particular cruelty, the way someone might mutter to themselves while washing dishes. Then she would step outside to smoke, and the door would close again. Vivian came in the evenings, late, when When the hallway had gone quiet, she sat on the edge of the bed and cried. During the first 2 nights, Anthony listened to that crying and couldn't think of anything at all. On the 3rd night, she spoke while she cried. She told him he had to wake up, that Cormac couldn't hold things together, that he had just ruined something with the people on the other side, and now they were demanding to meet with her. She said he had to wake up before the end of the month. She said she didn't know how to manage any of it anymore. Then she wiped her face, straightened his blanket, tucked both edges carefully beneath the mattress exactly the way she had when he was a child, and walked out. Anthony lay there listening to the door close, and he understood something very simple. His mother wasn't crying for him. She was crying for time. She was counting down toward some deadline he didn't yet understand. And in 7 days, she hadn't once asked the doctor whether he was in pain. By the 8th day, Meredith stopped using the main entrance. The night shift changed at 9 o'clock, and during the roughly 15 minutes when one shift handed over to the next, only one person remained at the first-floor desk. She arrived at exactly that time every night, and by the 3rd night, the person on duty recognized her and stopped asking questions. Marla Pratt left at 8:30. From 9 o'clock until nearly midnight, there was no one in room 406 except the 2 of them. Meredith pulled a chair close to the bed, switched on the small lamp beside the cabinet, and opened the book she carried in her bag. It was the novel she still taught to her 11th grade class, the one with a corner peeling away from the cover and pencil marks crowded along the margins. She read aloud from the first page, about 20 pages each night, and she read slowly, exactly the way she did from the front of her classroom, pausing in the right places, lowering her voice in the right places. Sometimes she stopped to explain a difficult word, as though there were still 30 students sitting in the room listening to her. When she finished reading, she told him about her day. She told him that her mother was still receiving dialysis 3 times a week, and that she had gained a little over 1 pound that week. She told him Theo had gone back to work but still had to lean to one side whenever he bent down. She told him she had taken on 2 more tutoring sessions at the community center, and that there was an 11th grader named Danny who had missed 3 sessions in a row the week before, then come back this week and sat silently in the last row without saying anything, and she had simply let him sit there until he opened his notebook on his own. Then, before she left, she lifted his right hand, rested it palm up in her own, and wrote on it with the tip of her index finger. She formed 1 letter at a time, slowly and clearly, pausing for a beat between each one. On the first night, she wrote only her name. On the second night, she wrote, "I'm here." On the 4th night, she wrote, "Mom is well." On the 7th night, she wrote, "Keep sleeping." She didn't expect anything. She simply did it, then lowered his hand, pulled the blanket up, turned off the light, and left. It was the same every night, for 10 nights. On the 11th night, she finished her 20 pages, closed the book, and lifted his hand as she always did. She wrote, "It was cold today." Then she sat quietly as usual, waiting a few seconds before lowering his hand. His index finger moved. Meredith didn't move. She kept her hand exactly where it was beneath his, and held her breath. The finger lifted slightly, stopped, then traced a line across her palm. 1 letter, then another, then the final 2. 4 letters, written so slowly that she had to count them in her head 3 times before she dared believe them. T-H-E-O. She sat upright, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She whispered his name, and nothing changed in his face. Not a single muscle, not one flicker of an eyelid, but his finger remained there, waiting. Meredith lifted a hand to cover her mouth, and she cried without making a sound for nearly a minute. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand, drew in a long breath so her voice wouldn't shake even though there was no one to hear it, pulled the chair closer, and wrote into his palm that Theo was alive, that he had already gone back to work. His finger moved once. She understood that as acknowledgement. From that night on, everything passed through the tip of a finger. She wrote in short phrases, 1 clause at a time, waiting for him to tap once before continuing. It took her nearly 2 hours to tell him everything that had happened during the past 2 weeks, and she arranged it all in chronological order, exactly the way she had drawn 4 columns across the blank sheets of paper at home. She wrote that Cormac had reversed everything Anthony had done before the council. She wrote that his mother was paying the nurse twice the normal rate, and paying her in cash. She wrote that they had barred Meredith from seeing him for 7 days. She wrote that she had found the leather-bound ledger in the 2nd drawer and had photographed 17 pages. His finger tapped twice in quick succession, and she stopped. She understood that he was asking a question. She wrote that the photographs weren't lost, that she had sent them to Theo that same day, before they erased her phone. Then she wrote 3 more letters, more slowly than anything she had written before. FBI. His hand remained still for a very long time. She waited. She didn't know whether the silence meant he was thinking, whether he disagreed, or whether he had simply become exhausted. She didn't pull her hand away, and didn't write anything more. She only sat there with his hand resting in her palm. Then his index finger lifted and tapped once. Only once. Meredith bent forward, pressed her forehead against the back of his hand, and stayed that way until she heard the wheels of a cart passing in the hallway outside. Before leaving, she wrote in his palm that she would come back at 9 o'clock the following night. Then she lowered his hand, pulled the blanket up, switched off the small lamp, and left the room at exactly 11:40. 4 nights later, Vivian arrived later than usual. Anthony heard the sound of her heels stop outside the door for quite a while before she came in. She didn't turn on the main light. She pulled the chair closer, sat down, and for nearly 10 minutes, she didn't say anything at all. Then she began to speak, and her voice was different from the nights before. She wasn't crying. She said she was going to tell him this only once, because this was the only time in her life she could say it without having to suffer any consequences. She said that on the day he called the family together and announced that 18-month plan, she had sat silently through the rest of dinner and hadn't objected once. She said that very same night she had called Gregor Sloane. She said she had arranged to meet him at a diner outside Cicero, had sat with him for exactly 40 minutes, and she had been the one to make the offer first. She said he had even asked her twice whether she was serious because he couldn't believe who was sitting across from him. She said she hadn't taken a single cent from him. She said that on the contrary, she had been the one paying him. One payment every month, written by hand in the ledger she kept in the second drawer, in exchange for his being ready whenever she needed him. She said she knew Antoni would ask why. Then she answered the question herself. She said she had come into this house when she was 23 years old. She said his father had been dead for 12 years, and for those 12 years, she had been the one who arranged the seating at every funeral, every wedding, every baptism across all 5 families. She said that when she walked into a room, people stood up, that people remembered her name, that she even remembered the names of their children away at college whom she had once asked about, and that she had spent 40 years accustomed to living that way. She said he believed he was saving this family, but he hadn't asked a single person whether they wanted to be saved. She said that if all of it disappeared, he would still have the construction company, still have the port, still be 38 years old, and still have a wife. She said that she, on the other hand, would be a 63-year-old woman sitting alone in a house too large for her, and there wouldn't be a single person left in the world who would stand when she entered a room. She said, "You intend to take my life away from me and call it salvation." She fell silent for a while. Then she said she wasn't sorry. She said that if she could go back to that night, she would still call Gregor Sloane. She said only that she had told them not to shoot, that she had made it perfectly clear that no one was to touch her son, and that even now she still didn't know who had given a different order. She said she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Then she straightened his blanket, stood, and spoke one final sentence before leaving the room. She said there were 3 days left before the council session, and that if he could still hear her, he should know that after that meeting, the Rourke name would never again be spoken the way it once had been. The door closed. Antoni remained still. He didn't move a single muscle, didn't open his eyes, didn't change the rhythm of his breathing. He had been fully conscious for 4 days, and he kept himself exactly that way. During the day, when Marla Pratt washed him and muttered her familiar complaints, he let his body go completely limp, exactly like someone who wasn't there at all. At night, after Meredith left, he began to practice. He started with his toes, 10 movements at a time, then his ankles, then his left hand, then his arm. By the 3rd day, he could bend his right knee about 4 inches before lowering it again. By the 5th day, he could turn onto his side and hold himself there for 10 seconds. The pain in his head was still there, surging every time he tried to sit up, so he didn't try. He did only what he was capable of doing, a little more each night than the night before, and by morning he lay motionless again, exactly as he had been. Meredith was the only person who knew. She brought him over-the-counter pain medication hidden inside a pencil case, at exactly the dose she had asked a pharmacist about at a drugstore 3 blocks from her apartment. She lifted his leg so he could exercise while she read aloud, so that if anyone passed through the hallway, all they would hear was her reading. She brought him information piece by piece, writing it into his palm in the order she had arranged at home. She wrote that the council would meet at 10 o'clock Friday morning. She wrote that Arthur Kessler had refused to meet with her 3 times. She wrote that Theo said Sloane's men had come to the estate twice that week, and both times they had used the back entrance. She told no one that Anthony was awake. Not her mother, not Theo, not the female agent on Roosevelt Road. She understood that if even one more person knew, he wouldn't live through the following night. For the final 3 days, she taught during the day, graded papers in the afternoon, arrived at the hospital at 9 o'clock each night, and not a single person saw anything unusual about that woman at all. On Thursday night, Sabrina came to the estate alone. She didn't take off her coat. She went into Vivian's study, closed the door, and said she had come to tell her in advance what was going to happen the next morning, because Vivian was the only person left in that house who was still clear-headed enough to understand. Vivian told her to sit down. Sabrina didn't sit. She said that at 10 o'clock the next morning, the council would formally confirm Cormac as head of the Rourke family, and that during the same meeting he would sign an alliance agreement concerning the Eastern Port. She said control of the port operations would be transferred to the Sloan side within 90 days. Vivian said that wasn't part of the agreement. Sabrina said yes, it wasn't the agreement Vivian had negotiated, and that she should understand why. Then she said the name. She said her father was Gregor Sloan. She said she had married Cormac Rourke 3 years earlier, exactly the way someone placed a piece onto a board, that he had never known whose daughter she was, and that for 3 years he had continued bragging to the men beneath him that he had married a girl with no one standing behind her. Vivian rose from her chair. She didn't say anything for several seconds. Sabrina continued, her voice still as gentle as it had been when she asked about Mrs. Marsh's medications. She said Cormac would sit in that chair, sign the papers, be called boss, and within a year he wouldn't be able to make a single decision for himself. She said Vivian was different, because Vivian knew too much. She said her father greatly appreciated everything Vivian had done, and he believed she deserved to rest, perhaps in Florida, where she had a house registered in her sister's name. She gave the exact street name, and even the name of the next-door neighbor. Then she wished Vivian good night, and left. Vivian remained in her study for a very long time after she heard the car drive through the gates. She had spent 40 years becoming the kind of woman people stood for when she entered a room. She had sold her eldest son to preserve that, and now she understood that she had sold him to someone who intended to erase her name the moment the work was finished. At 11 o'clock that night, she went down to the storage building behind the estate. Cormac was there with 2 of his men, and Theo Barrett was sitting on a wooden chair with his hands tied behind his back. Cormac had been holding him since that afternoon, after someone reported that the young driver had copied files from the family computer. Cormac turned around and told his mother to leave. Vivian didn't. She said to let the boy go. Cormac said he was handling his own business. Vivian said that at 10 o'clock the next morning he would be sitting in the chair at the head of this family, and if a 22-year-old boy was found in his storage building in the morning, that chair wouldn't belong to him anymore. She said it in the calm voice of someone making a calculation, not someone asking for a favor. Cormac cursed once, then told his men to cut the ropes. Vivian personally led Theo out through the rear gate. There, beneath the porch light, she stopped and told him to listen carefully. She said 10 o'clock the next morning. The building on La Salle Street, 11th floor, main conference room. She named the 5 families that would be there. She told him to go back and repeat it to that girl exactly as she had said it. Theo asked why she was doing this. Vivian looked at him and said she wasn't doing it for anyone. She said she had signed an agreement, and the other side had changed the terms. That was all. Then she turned back toward the house and closed the door behind her. Theo walked 2 blocks before he dared call for a car. He reached the apartment on the south side at 1 o'clock in the morning. Meredith opened the door, saw his wrists, and didn't ask anything. He said immediately, while still standing in the doorway, that he was all right, that he hadn't told them a single word. She poured him some water, let him sit and catch his breath, then took out paper and a pen and told him to repeat everything word for word. He did. She wrote it down. When he finished, she made a very short phone call to the number printed on the slip of paper with her case number, left a message consisting of 3 sentences, then hung up. After that, she took an envelope from the cabinet containing copies of the 2 documents that the notary office had reprinted for her that afternoon. The same documents Arthur Kessler had refused 3 times to give her, but which the records office had no reason to withhold. She placed the envelope in her bag, along with her grading notebook and a small voice recorder. Then she sat down at the table, wrote out 1 page containing what she intended to say, read it 3 times, folded it, and put it into her coat pocket. She slept for exactly 2 hours. At 9:50 on Friday morning, on the 11th floor of the building on La Salle Street, 11 men were already seated around the table. Cormac sat at the head. Sabrina stood behind her husband. At exactly 10 o'clock, Just as the secretary finished reading the first line of the minutes, the conference room door opened. The person who walked in was Meredith Marsh. She came alone, a document case in her hand, and walked straight to the empty place in the middle of the table. One man told her to leave. Meredith opened the case and placed 2 documents on the table. She said she was there as Antony Rourke's fully authorized representative for legal and business matters, under powers signed nearly 3 months earlier, just 3 days after the wedding, properly notarized and kept on file at Kessler's office. Everyone at the table turned toward Arthur Kessler. He remained seated for several seconds, then stood, picked up the 2 documents, examined them, and said the signatures were genuine, the seals were genuine, and under the council's rules, a person holding valid power of attorney had the right to speak and vote on behalf of their family. No one told her to leave again. Meredith opened the notebook she used for grading. She said she would present 3 things, and she would be brief. First, she placed on the table printed copies of 17 pages from the payment ledger in Vivian Rourke's handwriting, showing monthly payments transferred to the Sloan side beginning in March. Second, she placed a small recorder in the center of the table and pressed the button. Sabrina's voice filled the room, calm and clear, saying that her father was Gregor Sloan, that the port would be transferred to the Sloan side within 90 days, and that Cormac would sit in that chair but within a year would no longer be able to make a single decision for himself. Theo had hidden a running digital voice recorder behind the books in Vivian's study the previous afternoon before he was detained. Cormac shot to his feet. Third, Meredith placed down the records concerning Pier 4 and the date and time Walter Nash had passed the information outside. Then the conference room door opened again. Antony walked in with a cane, moving slowly but on his own feet, and sat in the nearest chair. Everyone in the room stood. Cormac didn't. He came around the table, grabbed Meredith by the arm, and pulled her backward toward the window. He said no one was to move. Antony didn't stand. He spoke to Walter Nash, calling him by name, and told him that if he walked out of that room right now, it would be the last thing he could still do for his wife. Walter Nash didn't leave. He took 1 step toward Cormac. It was the wrong step. Theo came across the table, and everything was over in about 4 seconds. Cormac was pinned to the floor. Meredith remained standing, still gripping her notebook tightly in one hand. Antony stayed exactly where he was in the chair. He looked at his younger brother being held down on the floor, and he gave no order at all. He only said that he wasn't going to do anything to him. Then he placed one final piece of paper on the table, bearing a case number and an official receipt stamp. He said that everything they had just seen and heard had already been in the hands of the Chicago FBI office for 3 days. And he said the person who had taken it there wasn't him. He looked at his wife. No one in the room said another word. The indictment was announced 6 weeks later under the RICO Act. Cormac Rourke was sentenced to 24 years in prison. Walter Nash received 25 years. Sabrina Sloan cooperated with prosecutors and received a much lighter sentence. Gregor Sloan was indicted along with 7 other people. Vivian Rourke pleaded guilty as an accomplice and received 11 years. Antony Rourke pleaded guilty, signed a full cooperation agreement, accepted the forfeiture of most of his assets, and served 22 months in federal prison. The construction company was allowed to remain in operation, paying 170 employees on the books, many of whom had once depended on the old routes for their livelihoods. Before the day he was taken away, Antony met his mother one final time in a visitation room. Vivian sat down and didn't ask about his health. She asked him only one question, whether he forgave her. Antony looked at her for a long time. Then he said he was still paying for her lawyer, and that was all he had left to give her. She nodded. When the visit ended, he was the first to stand. 2 years later, during the week he was released from prison, Ruth Marsh was living in a small house on the west side of the city. She had received a kidney transplant the previous spring, and the donor had been her daughter. Theo Barrett was in his first year of college on a scholarship. Meredith had returned to the same school with the metal detector at the main entrance, and every afternoon she still stayed after 4 o'clock. On the first Thursday after his release, Antony arrived at the school at 4. The security guard asked who he was waiting for. He said his wife's name, then sat in a plastic chair in the hallway until 5:30. When Meredith came out, she took his right hand, turned it palm up in hers, and wrote a single word across it. This time, he didn't write back. He said it aloud. There are people who spend their entire lives entering rooms where no one stands for them. No one remembers their names. No one considers them dangerous enough to watch. And because of that, they see the things everyone else overlooks. A person's worth isn't measured by the power or wealth they hold, but by the way they treat those who have nothing to offer them in return. And sometimes, What saves an entire family isn't strength at all, but one person who has grown accustomed to staying behind after everyone else has gone home. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And have you ever known someone in your own life who was overlooked, but turned out to be the person others could truly lean on? Please leave a comment so we can listen to what comes from deep within your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.